Welcome to the second session of the conference at the cutting edges of knowledge production, borders and black holes in academic dialogue. For the first time, this network meeting unites the BMBF, the Federal Ministry of Research, Education and Research, funded large-scale projects in the social sciences and humanities, such as the Maria Sibylla Merian Centers, the Käthe Hamburger colleagues, and the area study projects in an academic discussion in 3 thematic sessions. So first, I would like to extend a warm welcome to the representatives of the centers, as well as to the representatives of the ministry and the DLR. This session will be recorded, so I suppose that all you who now participate in the session agree on that. And a special concern of this conference is to promote trans-regional exchange and dialogue, especially with academic partners in other world regions on pressing issues in the social sciences and humanities. Therefore, also a very warm welcome to the representatives and staff of the centers, as well as to all of you who are joining this session via YouTube or Zoom. In Zoom, you can choose on the globe button at the bottom of the screen the Spanish version or the English version of this conference. In YouTube, you have 2 channels. So the colors at the colors channel of YouTube, you can listen to and see the Spanish version of this conference, and on the CS channel, the English translation. In the first session of this network meeting, we addressed the issues of global climate and environmental crisis in the area of the Anthropocene, a topic that, as we can see from the current climate conference in Glasgow, has the highest political relevance. No less relevant is a topic that marks the beginning of the social sciences, the question of social inequalities. On the one hand, we see that conventional social inequality research along the poor-rich axis has significantly worsened in recent decades, and this at different scales of research. At a global level, the 1% of the rich have more wealth than the remaining 99% combined. But even between the global north and the global south, which are explicitly not to be understood as geographical concepts alone, inequality has not decreased. Similarly, there are significant social disparities up to and including segregation at various spatial scales, from units such as the nation state to the city. On the other hand, the debate about social inequalities, here explicitly in the plural, has diversified and fanned out into different dimensions of inequality. These include gender, race, ethnicity, but also age, origin, or other characteristics. These inequalities also pervade the academic field. Certain privileged or underprivileged positions and locus of initiation also led to the fact that problem situations are perceived differently or not at all. And they are conceptualized in a correspondingly subordinate way. But also in terms of research practice, economic inequality, which can also translate into the power to identify and interpret problems, repeatedly leads to tensions in the academic field, especially in trans-regional projects. But it is precisely in these tensions and contact zones and different horizons of experience and patterns of interpretation that we see a certain potential for novelty and creativity. In this sense, I wish us all a stimulating debate in this first panel. The procedure in the panel is as follows. Each of the 4 speakers will give a 20-minute presentation. After all presentations, there will be space for an overarching discussion of all presentations. You can ask questions and comments in the chat of the Zoom or also in the chat of the different 2 YouTube channels. For the participants of the Zoom, there will be also the additional possibility to participate directly with an oral intervention. Please raise your hand. So it is my pleasure to begin and introduce first to you Andreas Eckert from Rework, Work and Human Life Cycles in Global History. Andreas is professor of African history at Humboldt University in Berlin, and since 2009, director of the Käthe-Hamburger Kolleg Work and Human Life course in Global History, Rework. He has published widely on modern African history, global labor history, slavery and colonialism, and his recent publications include General History of Labor in Africa with Stefano Bellucci and Geschichte der Sklaverei von der Antike bis zum 21. Jahrhundert. And I think his intervention will be particularly insightful for the historical roots and the exploitation of labor in the perspective of new global social history. And now, Andreas, you have the word for the first presentation.
Thank you, Olaf. Thank you very much, and welcome to all of you. And I just share my screen. Oops. What do you see? Oh.
You see your browser, your email browser.
Yeah, exactly. There was something wrong with it, so I just have to.
We see BMBF.
No. Okay, so now you see? Hello?
No, the screen isn't shared yet.
Oh, shit. This is not some issue. Okay, then I have
a second click on screen sharing.
Yeah, I did. Okay, maybe, but there was something. Anyway, I do without. I'm sorry. I only had 7 or 8 photographs, but I can probably doing without them. So as I have now 18 minutes left and have a rather tour d'horizon to make, my point is, I mean, I will really look over the last 60 years of independent Africa in a rather generalized matter. Of course, I skip all the very important regional differences when talking about the relationship between labor, poverty, and also social welfare or social security, and try to make some points also by looking at some concepts that are very much en vogue, like informality and precarity, and that might also then link to probably broader discussions, because these concepts are now, I think, important not only for Africa or the global South, but for Northern Europe as well. I start with quoting from an article two sociologists cum historians from the Netherlands, Jan Bremen and Marcel van der Linden, had published, I think 7 years ago, called Informalizing the Economy. And in this article, they argue that, quote, the real norm or standard in global capitalism is insecurity, informality, or precariousness, end of quote. So if this is the case, then in many ways, Africa in the 20th and early 21st century could be seen as a model case for global capitalism. Because much of the history of this continent during this period was characterized by poverty, precarious labor relations, the large absence of state or company welfare measures, as well as efforts to challenge precariousness. So when I now analyze the so-called social question in Africa since the end of the colonial period, with a focus on social insecurity and labor, I do it against a backdrop of a related literature that largely ignores the continent. So, of course, there's a rich field in social studies about the welfare and the welfare state. But to say the least, Africa does not feature very prominently in that literature. I mean, take Espen Anderson's famous typology of welfare state, which of course completely ignores Africa, but also in the index of the more recent authoritative Oxford Handbook of the Welfare State. I mean, all these Oxford handbooks, of course, very much kind of present a certain authority in the field. Africa is listed in this index twice. And these references are related to trade unions and unemployment insurance. And when we look then at the reference pages, we only learn that unionization rates are lowest worldwide throughout much of Africa, and that Africa is the weakest area in social insurance development. So for a long time, and these might be some more examples. Africa seems to have served as the epitome of otherness, not only in the history of welfare and labor, but in much Western scholarship. So a Europe or West-centered perspective still often places Africa at the other end of the development spectrum. So as a region that simply does not fit the patterns elsewhere. And elsewhere is, of course, still very much the North Atlantic framework, but even compared to other areas like Asia, now Africa is often seen as somewhat lagging behind or being different. Although my argument would be that looking at the history and also the more recent history of the social question in Africa has a great deal to offer by way of lessons to a global perspective on related issues that is interesting in tracing the historical connections between regions and in critically engaging with the idea that the North Atlantic world is still the normal and the rest is exceptional or in need of explanation. So if our analysis of the social question has to transcend the notion of a single telos modeled after the example of the West that is supposed to be achieved everywhere, or if you go beyond the conception that the non-realization of this telos represents somehow a lack or a lack in the societies concerned, to understanding the specific examples coevally. So this is, of course, the famous insight of Johannes Fabian, that most societies are denied this coevalness with that of the West. Then we must take the different social forms in Africa seriously in all their complexity, but also in all their linkages with welfare and labor forms elsewhere. And I will try to make these links, or at least offer some points where this link could be made. So around 1960, when most African colonies gained independence, numerous observers thought that with population growth having accelerated since after 1945, and with the urban population growing faster than the rural, a class of landless manual workers would be created and Africa would reproduce European patterns. So, I mean, in many ways they thought, without often spelling it out, that some kind at least of Marx primitive accumulations would happen in Africa. So there was a widespread assumption that Africa was becoming proletarianized, its working class was growing and becoming better defined and more self-conscious. And indeed, from the late 1950s into the 1970s, many African countries experienced at least modest economic growth, life expectancy rose considerably, and education became more accessible. And also the emergence of elements, at least, of a welfare state raised considerably expectations. State employees, workers in copper mines or railwaymen, for instance, had reasonable hopes that they could get something out of participation in economic activities. But these decades, in retrospect, proved not to be a midpoint in a kind of natural transition from a non-wage labor to wage labor economy in a welfare state. While it is difficult to count precisely, it is clear that the number of hired workers in sub-Saharan Africa was, of course, vastly greater by 1960 than it had been in 1900, and it is much greater today than it was around the time of independence. Yet, labor markets since the end of colonial rule are characterized much more by short-term hiring and high turnover of workers than by long-term stable employment. So precarious labor prevailed both in the formal and the informal space. So the aspirations of millions of Africans who had seemed reasonable for turning jobs, especially unionized stable jobs, with pension funds promised at the end, into a career proved unrealizable. The mining sector in Zambia, on the Zambian copper belt to be more precise, initially promised steady material rewards as measured by salary and health and retirement benefits, as well as other more ineffable return in terms of cultural cachet and social status. The pathway to working class stability and respectability soon came to an end with the oil crisis, structural adjustment programs, and fluctuating global copper prices. What meager resources these miners kept for their old age came not so much from the formal institutions of modern welfare capitalism, that is social security, pensions, medical insurance, or the contractual gains won by trade unions, but sets of personal relationships that X- could draw on or forge. Petty trade, access to farmlands through social relations in the village of origin, or support by kin networks became necessary to survive in the context of a contracting regulated wage labor sector. The big man notion of self-esteem that had given a new dimension by wage earning increasingly confronted the fact that women engaged in urban marketing or other activities were now contributing more or often more to the family economy and provided that stability that male wages could not. So the bureaucratized world of work had not eclipsed the world of social relations. If it had done so, the collapse would have been even more deadly than it was anyway. So young men whose social power long rested on their ability to earn wages increasingly find themselves now, since 30 years or 40 years, in a more precarious position. In turn, others, notably women and pensioners, acquired new powers and possibilities. And this transformation is partly due to the relative expansion of work in service industries that are more open to women as the blue-collar jobs and industries of the past. And the increasing patterns or instability of economic prospects in many African countries had also changed migration patterns, which was central to African economies since the first half of the 20th century. But it had been now overtaken by more permanent rural-urban migration and by large-scale labor migration to Europe and beyond. Africans are more likely now to travel longer distances in search of employment. And in the 21st century, many African countries have apparently became increasingly dependent upon the productive activities and remittances of their citizens who live abroad in other African countries or in Europe, Asia, the Gulf states, or the United States. And that was, of course, also one of the big kind of transformations or vulnerabilities during the pandemic, when a lot of these remittances couldn't get back. And then some people finally realized how important they are for the economy of many states, and then especially for a number of reasons. So in Senegal, you can see that in some regions, remittances make up to sometimes 70% of the income. By the 1970s, the ILO began to use the evocative but sloppy term urban informal sector for the urban dimension of what did not fit inside national labor legislations and a bounded, stabilized working class. They used the term urban informal sector, which pointed to the continued, indeed growing importance of forms of work that lay outside the form of labor legislation that African countries inherited at independence and outside the limits of the imagination of policymakers who thought they were modernizing Africa. Although some Africanists insist that African economies are the most informalized in the world, non-wage economic activities, unregulated by law and unprotected by social regulations or services, have become increasingly visible in many parts of the world, including the North Atlantic region. And in Indian, for instance, in Indian labor statistics now, I think the informal sector is around 75 or 78%. And so the discovery of the informal went in pair with the observation that full-time wage labor with relatively good social benefits over the course of an entire career was not at all a global norm, but rather the exception in many parts of the world, in a way the contingent product of a particular conjuncture in 20th century world history. And of course, much can be said or discussed about the term and how adequate it is and what alternatives are possible. I leave that aside, but as a historian, I'm especially interested also when the term really came up and the conjuncture. So it came up in the early 70s and in the time of the oil crisis and a kind of worldwide recession and crisis. And it very much was linked, or the career of this term was linked to the rise of the political and ideological formation that now commonly is referred to as neoliberalism. I don't like the term. I think it hides more than it explains, but still I think there is some connection here. And I think it would be very interesting to rethink also from different world areas, so to speak. I mean, when this idea of the informal gained ground and how it was connected to broader developments. So while the term informal might be problematic and not sufficiently differentiated as an analytical tool, it refers to processes that are very crucial to the social question in Africa. So when the world economic crisis of the 1970s hit Africa hard, most governments were forced to seek aid from the International Monetary Fund and other international institutions, which in turn enforced the destruction of much that could be considered social. The right to education, medical care, a livable wage was undermined in the name of financial rigor. Cutbacks in the public sector and social programs eroded the number of waged employees. Households were forced to diversify their sources of income, and informal activities increasingly suffered from the uncertain juridical status and the volatility of their finances. Small-scale workshops were often characterized by low surplus and strong competition, and usually not more than severely undercapitalized and unskilled businesses. Market women particularly suffered, as they were faced with falling incomes of poor and working class customers, and more had to compete with men engaged as street vendors after losing their wage jobs. What could also be observed was dividing a given activity in ever finer morsels. As Fred Cooper emphasized, a young man who in the 1970s would have sold tiny packets of peanuts in the street of Dakar, or in the 2000s low denomination phone top-up cards, finds a niche because his labor is worth so little that an entrepreneur can employ him to sell things to people too poor to spend a significant sum of money at a time. So this reality on the ground stands in stark contrast to celebratory statements of the World Bank and some NGOs highlighting the energy and skill of the small-scale entrepreneur. And there's a bitter irony that empowerment through informal enterprise, so cherished by neoliberal commentators, was undermined by neoliberal politics that drastically weakened the very institutions such as family, education, and basic safety nets upon which informal entrepreneurship is based. So I'm slowly coming to an end before you warn me that I'm running out of time. African independent states, I think this is important just as a broad background, inherited a complex and potentially explosive combination of authoritarian governance, high expectations for improved living conditions, a limited extent of formal employment, and already fragmented trade unions. Thus, even before the devastating impact of the oil crisis, followed by structural adjustment programs, wage labor was never available as a foundation of an egalitarian and democratic society. And at the same time, labor coercion and personal dependence did not disappear, often facilitated by poverty at all levels. The colonial discourse of development that began in the 1930s and continued after independence relabeled work that otherwise could have been classified as forced labor as voluntary work, self-help, or human investment. In this process, certain sections of African labor were rendered invisible as workers and instead constructed as beneficiaries, participants, or volunteers. The issue of forced labor continued to be debated after independence. In 1962, the ILO Committee of Experts on the Application of Conventions and Recommendations criticized a number of recently independent African countries, such as Guinea and the Ivory Coast, for having set up forms of forced labor in the form of compulsory labor services for young people. And the problem of unfreedom never went away. It is diffused and can be found in many sectors or embedded in various labor relations. In 2016, the ILO estimated that there were a total of over 9.2 million victims of modern slavery in Africa. Immigrant workers from Africa are part of this number. And the question is, in fact, how to label all those Africans who, by their own initiative, cross the Mediterranean Sea to Italy or Spain, or the Atlantic to the Canary Islands to seek wage labor. Those Africans who, between the 16th and 19th centuries, were sent across the Atlantic to work on slave plantations in the Americas were coerced, and they were called slaves. Today's migrants, however, are in some ways, and that sounds cynical, but in some ways, the freest of the free, because they not only agree to leave Africa for Europe, but they go to great effort and great risk to do so. Often people with some means and educations dare the dangerous and expensive trip with the idea to make some money in Europe in order to support the family back home. Those Africans who make it to Europe, usually after a traumatic voyage via the desert and the Mediterranean Sea, definitely work under conditions that deserve the label precarious. Their ideas about a Europe full of opportunities, if they had these illusions and less have them, soon vanish. They are mostly sans-papiers, and they're subject to deportation or exploitation by employers who misuse their vulnerability. To end, it would be misleading, I think, that would be my broader argument maybe to discuss comparatively, to see informal and precarious work only as a new phase in capitalism, in which workers in many parts of the world, and most notably in Africa, have become unnecessary, disposable. Multinational capital might still need many workers from Africa and other places, as long as they are cheap, particularly to reach customers of modest means. Moreover, precarity could be seen as a constitutive feature of capitalist labor, inasmuch as uncertainty and instability have always been inherent characteristics of wage labor in Africa and elsewhere. Yet, the big problem in a way is that political mobilization of and collective bargaining for precarious and informal workers remain in challenge. And the other point is that some authors now indicate that given the ongoing increase of land grabs, with states helping to alienate land to both foreign and domestic capitalists, in combination with the increasing pressure of population on land and on soil fertility, it is not unlikely that landlessness will supersede the lack of labor power as a major source of poverty in Africa. I end now on this very negative point, but I think it is important to face that land and labor, as we all know, are closely linked, and that these go together. And when we think about what could be done or what are the kind of solutions, I think we have not only in Africa, I think these two points together. But at the moment on this front, there are rather bad news on Radio Africa, and I think there is no way to really deny this. So sorry for ending so miserably, but still I think it is enough food for discussion anyway. Thank you very much, and sorry that again my PowerPoint somehow disappeared, but okay, you had to listen to me without some photos. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Andreas, for this really great outlook on the longue durée and the different conjunctures of precarious, informal, migrant labor in different regions of Africa. And furthermore, I would say also the epistemological implication of certain concepts we still manage. That's what we meant with black holes. So that we still consider North Atlantic experience and concepts deriving from this experience as the normal, forgetting that probably most of the world is not has not lived this kind of condition and historical experience. Well, you gave the work with this bad news and negative impression, and I'm very curious now to hear the talk of Sergio Costa, and as he brings in very dialectical concepts of inequality and conviviality. I suppose that in the concept of conviviality, which includes the idea of the social, we have also some, so to say, optimistic outlook to not deprime ourselves too much. But let me introduce to you Sergio Costa now. Sergio Costa is co-director and speaker of the Maria Sibylla Merian Center Conviviality, Inequality in Latin America, Mecila. He's trained in economics and sociology in Brazil and Germany, and a professor of sociology and director of the Institute for Latin American Studies at Free University Berlin. His areas of interest are postcolonial theory, inequality research, racism, anti-racism, conviviality, and difference. His most recent books are A Port in Global Capitalism and Entre el Atlántico y el Pacífico Negro, both co-authored works. But now, Sergio, we would like to hear you with the co-constitution of inequality and conviviality. You have the word. I think we have a problem. I can't hear you at least. Can you?
We are too old for this technique. No?
Yeah, it's always like this. If the test works fine and everything is well in.
I had 2 PowerPoints today who worked, but this one not. Yeah. This is I don't know. Murphy's law.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much. I don't know what happened because, as you said, in the test, everything worked, but now I'm there. So thank you so much for the invitation. It's really, I'm very, very glad to share this panel with my fellow colleagues and really outstanding scholars in their fields. And also the whole initiative, the conference, extremely exciting and interesting. Thank you also, Carlos and Beth, for including me in this panel. What I'm going to share with you, and I hope I can really share my presentation. Let's try. I hope it works. Yes, it seems it works. Can you see my presentation? Yeah, fine. Okay, so actually my presentation has a different character of Andreas Eckert's presentation. I will actually concentrate on a sort of research rationale of our Merian Center, and at the end I will also give some examples for research projects who are developing just now. I think this is a way to share with you a sort of research on inequality, which is combined with discussions on living together, social cohesion, and so on. And our attempt is actually to address both, to understand inequality as a way of living together and living together as a way of sharing inequalities. So in that way, according to our own perspective, you cannot separate these two things. So inequalities goes with living together, and living together is always living together and inequality. So in that way, we hoped to bring some discussion on inequality to more cultural fields of discussion, such as cohesion, multiculturalism, interculturality, and also in the opposite direction to bring more culture and everyday experiences in that what Germans call Sozialstrukturanalyse, so the analysis of social structure. So in that way is what I actually will try to share with you today. I will concentrate more on the research on conviviality, because I think this is the part of the presentations perhaps less known by the audience. So let's start with the state of the art in the discussions of conviviality. Conviviality is a very broad concept introduced in 1973 by the Austrian philosopher, theologist Ivan Illich, at that time in which Ivan Illich led a Center for Intercultural Communication in Cuernavaca, Mexico. That means that the concept from the very origin has to do with Latin America. And at that time, Illich tried to offer a concept for discussing relations not only between humans, but also between humans and their environment, including also other living beings which are not human. In that way, he was really a pioneer in discussing what we call today perhaps post-humanism and the whole discussion on planetary ethics and so on. So, but of course, other authors also work on this field. I just mentioned here two authors quite known. The first one is Artur Escobar, who also has worked on a sort of ecological critique of capitalism, and also Alain Caillé, who is a French sociologist, but with many followers and colleagues also in Latin America who work on the idea of convivialism as a way to construct a global society in which you have a better distribution of resources, and more than that, a better way to deal with the relation human nature. Important in this discussion is also the second field, and the second field especially dominated by anthropologists and also by indigenous thinkers who show actually that concepts of society developed by social scientists are actually not able to grasp indigenous societies and other forms of societies in which the separation between private and public and also between agency and structure are simply not there. So these thinkers contribute to reinforce the concept of conviviality as a sort of alternative concept for society as discussed by sociologists and other social sciences. Especially relevant is also our discussions on critiques on anthropocentrism, which show that social sciences and also humanities normally lead or normally treat societies or humans with a sort of human exceptionalism, giving the humankind a sort of privileged space in the planet, ignoring that we are all interdependent. So there is a strong interdependency between humans and non-human living beings in this planet. And if the living, non-human living beings, if they have a hard life, we humans will also have a life and we are also condemned to disappear. So here's the importance of conviviality to actually emphasize the interdependencies between humans and non-humans. Equally important is also for our discussion on conviviality, the critique of neoliberal multiculturalism, being the critique developed in Europe in case of critiques to politics of multiculturalism, which insist on separation of cultures, but also in Latin America, multiculturalism has played an important role, especially in the regulation of living together between indigenous, non-indigenous, and other so-called traditional communities. So this sort of separation defended in neoliberal multiculturalism is something which is criticized by these authors who use the idea of conviviality for insisting in the necessity of see relations between different cultures as sort of living together in difference and not being separated physically or socially. Also, in the German discussions, especially in case of some literary scholars, I mentioned two there, Ottmar Ettiges in the Müller, also created this neologism, convivence, for addressing this sort of living together in literature. So the idea here is that in novels and also in fiction, you find inspirations for living together in society. So there is no separation or radical separation between fiction and reality. So novels are also spaces of experimentation of living together. And finally, the last field in which the discussion on conviviality is very well developed is in post-colonial, decolonial studies. I mentioned two authors, Mbembe and also the German sociologist Gutierrez Rodriguez, who insist, and this is a completely different vein. So they show how conviviality, this sort of proximity, can be used, instrumentalized for giving legitimacy to relations of exploitation and also relations of subordination. So in that case, there is nothing to do with a good conviviality. Convivial relations are used, for instance, this is the case of research conducted by Gutierrez Rodriguez, for sustaining exploitation in domestic workers. So treating persons who work as domestic workers as part of the family is a way of sustaining situations of exploitation and also of inexistence of a labor contract. You see, in the different fields, there are sort of normative bias, with the exception of the critique of coloniality. The other fields in which this concept is developed, it has more to do with a sort of positive, a good conviviality. But for us, conviviality is more than that. Conviviality is always connected to inequality. And if you are talking about conviviality and inequality, we are also talking about living together in difference. So these three terms, conviviality, inequality, difference, they are inseparably together, and it's not really possible to treat one of these concepts without treat the other, according to our perception. Conviviality is different from just the words in Spanish, Portuguese, convivencia, also convivencia, as the neologism in Germany, because actually conviviality has to do with the sort of relational dimension of social life. So it's a focus on interactions and not in a picture of societies as a whole, but in the sort of interactions, social interactions, but also interactions between humans and non-humans. So inequalities, in a very similar sense as described by Olaf in his introductory remarks, we see inequalities in a broad sense, so inequalities as distance in social hierarchies concerning at least 4 different axes of inequalities. The first and more obvious one are material resources, and inequality research mostly concentrate only in this first axis, But we have, of course, also inequalities of power concerning positions and also positionalities, as already addressed by Olaf. And also environment is for us a dimension of inequality which should be addressed separately, especially because if you are talking about environmental inequalities or ecological inequalities, you are talking not only about access to health environment, you are also talking about exposure to risks. In that sense, this is a sort of negative axis of inequalities. It has not to do to have things, but to be protected against bads, so to say, against risks. And lastly, also epistemology, knowledge asymmetries, as also axis of inequality, which cannot be reduced to the other axis of inequalities mentioned before. Finally, for us, differences are also defined in relation to inequality. As you see there in the slide, differences are for us shared characteristics mobilized in the process of enunciating inequalities. So differences are, so to say, a site of enunciation, is a positionality from which we can denounce inequalities, but you can also protect inequalities. If the right-wing movement Pegida go to the streets to defend their condition as the real Germans, the true Germans, they are, of course, protecting a situation of inequality in relation to migrants. From the opposite side, if, I don't know, black women go to the streets in Brazil to protest against their labor conditions, they are actually fighting against inequality. So using their differences as black women for mobilizing against inequalities. So this is the sort of framework we use in our research. And just to give you a sense of our sort of research design we use in our center. So you see there, use this category of convivial configurations as our main unit of analysis or observation. We talk also about convivial regimes to understand convivial configurations through time. So in case, I don't know, in the relations between blacks and whites in Latin America, you can talk, for instance, from slavery as a particular convivial regime, but you have nowadays a sort of a compensatory regime in which many countries are creating policies to mitigating inequalities between blacks and whites. So we insist on interdisciplinarity, but I think this is a common feature of our projects presented in this conference. And we insist also on transdisciplinarity, which is understood among us as a sort of dialogue between academic and non-academic knowledge. So a dialogue with activists, with indigenous thinkers, also with very, so to say, normal people. This is our way to conduct our research, and we understood this as a sort of transdisciplinarity. And we see also our center, that I think here we have also a commonality with CALAS as a sort of bridge between Latin American, German, and international scholars and scholarship. So finally, Olaf, I don't know how many minutes I have, but this is also my last slide. Yes. Okay, just to give you a concrete example how to work with this sort of framework for understanding very concrete inequalities. We are conducting, and this is the first example, we are conducting research including a broad survey and also focus groups discussion in 4 countries, Germany, Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico, for understanding the effects of the pandemic in the so to say, nexus, conviviality, inequality. Are part of this survey is also designed to understand how the pandemic affects multi-species family. So in multi-species family, especially including, of course, humans, let's think of a conventional family, a father, mother, 2 children, and 2 dogs. So our intention is to understand, our aim in this research is to understand how the pandemic affects this sort of family arrangements in this case, and how, for instance, homeschooling, care work, or domestic work is shared between the family, and how, for instance, this is already findings of this survey, how, especially in case of homeschooling, especially what my colleague Juan Piovani is developing in Argentina, how homeschooling especially concentrated on the mother, and not on the whole family, or not on the father, especially on the mother. So these are developments that could be very well understood through this lens, inequality, conviviality. The second example, very brief, is a new social movement in Brazil, a sort of alliance of social movement, a Black Coalition for Rights in Brazil, as an attempt to react to the right-wing policies conducted by the current government, which especially affect Black Brazilians, in that way that some policies constructed during the last years have just obliterate in this period. So our intention in this research is to understand how this change in the legal political frameworks actually affect not only Black citizens, but citizens in general, and how they react to that, what kind of resistance is possible. And you see here the importance of have a unit of analysis which is not territorially, spatially based, but relationally based. So in that way, we can understand alliances not only within Brazil, within a municipality, but also transnational alliances, which are also an important part of this movement. And lastly, our interest is to understand if this movement is resisting against a change in the regime, in the convivial regime you have now, which is the sort of compensatory regime, which is actually designed for mitigating inequalities between Black and whites. And you see that the current government is trying to change this regime, and at least as hypothesis, we have the understanding that this movement is organized for trying to stop this sort of change in the current convivial regime. So thank you so much. I will stop sharing.
Yeah, thank you, Sergio, for these inspiring insights in your research. I think it's really challenging, this relating, connecting, entangling and bridging not only concepts but also research, also this doing research of Mecila, and I think there will be a lot of space for discussion for these topics. And I want to highlight especially also that I found it quite interesting to include this post-human multi-species dimension in social inequality, something that's very much related to the first day of discussions we had on the Anthropocene. But now I think we jump to otherwise back to the African continent. And Sergio has mentioned the impacts of the pandemics, which obviously is a great catalyst for social inequalities. And I think this relates directly to the research done by Rachid Ouaissa. But let me present first Rachid to you. Rachid is director of the Merian Center for Advanced Studies in the Maghreb, MECAM. which is working especially on imagining futures dealing with this parity. And he's a researcher and professor at Marburg University, head of the Department of Politics of the Near and Middle East at the Center for Near and Middle Eastern Studies at the Philipps University of Marburg. Amongst his publications, also some co-authored publications are recently Reconfigurations, Contextualizing Transformation Processes and Lasting Crisis in the Middle East and North Africa, or The Transformation of Politicized Religion, works about youth social movements, urban resistance, and the transformation processes in the Arabian world. And now we are very keen to hear from you, Rachid, how the situation has changed during the pandemics, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Olaf. Bin ich gut zu hören? Is it okay? Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Olaf, dear colleagues, for the invitation. I think my communication is completely different to the communication of Andreas with the longue durée tableau or of Sergio with this basic concepts and theory. I tried just to collect some data and to compare the situation before the pandemic and even after or within. We are still in the pandemic situation. So the data are mostly from different reports of the World Bank and other organizations like Oxfam and, of course, the National Institutes of Statistics like the Institut National des Statistiques Tunisien and other sources. The communication is on the impact of the pandemic on inequalities in the Maghreb. I mean, really the health of the Maghreb, Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia, and without taking in consideration the development in Libya or in Mauritania. So I want to start with some general remarks on inequalities in the Maghreb, because it's one of even what of the topics of our center in like in Brazil. I think it's similar to the question, the research question in Brazil. Inequalities are the important challenge in the Maghreb countries. So I start with some remarks on inequalities in the Maghreb before the pandemic, and then I try shortly to outline the situation within the pandemic, and I end with some concluding remarks. Even before the pandemic, the extreme poverty, we have a good situation. I mean, a positive development in the 2000 years in the whole, in the three countries. We have a decline of extreme poverty in the three countries of the Maghreb, but still inequality characterize the development in the three countries. Poverty and unemployment rates are unevenly distributed across age, gender, and geography. They are the three real factors of inequality in this country. And I think with the pandemic, we have a fourth one. I just come to this point. As I say, the World Bank report identify inequality as a major obstacle for the development in the Maghreb in the 2000 years. An Oxfam study shows that over the last 20 years, Morocco's growth has been dynamic, allowing a considerable reduction in poverty rates from 15.3% in 2001 to, for example, 5% in 2014. While the extreme poverty is relatively low with 3.1%, and the moderate poverty rate was by 16%. In In addition, almost 19% of Morocco's rural population that depend on agriculture still lives in poverty and are in risk to falling into poverty. The Gini coefficient was 39.9% in 1985 and fell to 39 in 2014. And here show that there is a good development, but we have the problem of youth unemployment, which reached in 2016 40%, and this problem of inequality. We have a specific economic situation in Morocco. Morocco is a country with more than 80% of labor is informal labor, and we have huge differences between the cost urban centers and the south centers, and we have differences between the Sahrawi areas and the urban center, and we have a special situation for women, and I come to this point later. In Algeria, it's a special also situation. We have an a rich oil country and with a vast territory. The poverty rates was just by 5% in 2001 with a Gini coefficient of 27.6 in 2011, and an extreme poverty rate is much lower than 0.5%, but the unemployment also in Algeria was in 2015 11%, in particularly high among women, 17%, and youth 30%. In Algeria, almost 75% of the poor live in urban areas, and here also the poverty is 3 times higher in the Sahara than in the north of the country. In Tunisia also you have a special situation, a country where the economy is based on tourism. So this with the pandemic, this sector is really in deep crisis. In Tunisia, statistics from the National Institut National de Statistics show that more than 50% of active population is unemployed. Before the pandemic, women are doubly affected by unemployment as men, with 22%, and that 14%, it means 1.6 million of Tunisians were still living below the poverty line in 2015, mostly in rural areas and more in the west than in the east of the country, and more in the south than in north of the country. And you remember the revolution was started even in these areas. The disparity between areas is really remarkable in Tunisia, and it's more than in other countries in North Africa. And we have a situation for the black population of Tunisia, which is still, let's see, isolated and extremely in bad situation compared to other Tunisians. In 2017, the richest 10% of the population held more than 40% of the national income, compared to the only 18% of the least well-off half of the population. According to the UNICEF report, more than 95% of children from the richest backgrounds attend high school, compared to the less than 2/3 of the children from poor backgrounds. And here also the Gini index fell from 43% in 85 to 32% in 2015. I mean, the situation was good in the 2000 years, but inequality was still a major challenge in those three countries. The pandemic now has deepened inequalities and now cover many more areas than before the pandemic. Large segments of the population are at risk of falling back into poverty and high unemployment rates, especially among young people and women. There are no real solid data for the impact of COVID in all sectors, but the Maghreb countries, but there exist some surveys and some reports, as I mentioned. The COVID pandemic has an unprecedented negative socioeconomic effects on the lives of millions of people across the world. But we have a special situation in the Maghreb, especially unequal access to basic services, market, labor, and education. According to the survey collected by the Tunisian National Institute of Statistics, more than half of the household interviewed report a deterioration of their living standards relative to before the start of COVID. About 40% of the poorest, the situation continued to deteriorate. The results suggest that poverty is expected to rise from 30% in Tunisia to 21% in 2020. In addition, inequality, I mean the Gini index mentioned, is projected to increase from 42%, which means the level of the 80s, mid of the 80s. And here also the regions affected more are the central, western, and southern eastern regions of Tunisia. And here also we have especially the unemployment of women, while 42% actually worked without contracts, and more than 74% of women risk to be in extreme poverty within the COVID. In Morocco, we have a special situation with the so-called cross-border workers. Thousands of Moroccan cross-border workers, I mean the workers working in Spanish enclave Ceuta and Melilla, with the confinement, they have to stay home. So we have approximately 1.6 million of Moroccan people who goes into misery. I mean extreme poverty, which means the official poverty rate in Morocco in 2020 is by 20%. Morocco is sure not an exception, but here the confinement was harsher for the most vulnerable segment of the population. Indeed, 72% of the responded to a survey done by the Institut National de Statistique belonged that 40% of Moroccan workers risk to be in extreme poverty after the pandemic. Close to 62% of employed workers report to have suffered of a decrease in their income. However, 74% of employed workers belonging to the poorest 20% were in that situation. in June 2020, more than a half of Moroccan employed workers were still on layoff. And here also we have an extreme, urban workers were more likely to resume their activity than rural workers. And the poverty rate increased from 7.3% to 16.7% in the last two years. And we have a rate of absolute poverty of 12%. So we have really a catastrophic situation in Morocco. And here we have a phenomenon of, especially for women, we have more than 60% of women has an experience with domestic violence in Morocco, and also we have women in Morocco are overrepresented in sectors, in professions that constitute the first line of defense against COVID, in the sense that they represent, according to the UN Women, 57% in medical personnel, 66% of paramedical personnel, and 60% of civil servants in social sectors. So we have here that the situation that women are more affected with the crisis of COVID, also physically, than men. And in Algeria, we have a kind of triple crisis in 2000. We have a political crisis, legitimacy crisis, which gave birth for a large protest movement called Hirak, and an economic crisis due to the crisis of oil in the world market, on the world market, and of course the COVID crisis. And we have also here a remarkable deterioration of the economic situation, and the rise of unemployment and violence. Also, 40% of the women has experience with domestic violence. But in Algeria, we have no real data compared to the two other countries because of the very authoritarian development in the last 2 years. So I conclude with some remarks. The COVID crisis has demonstrated the limits of governance in Maghreb countries. The Maghreb regimes has shown their inefficiency to manage this crisis. The sanitary crisis gave the birth to political crisis. In Tunisia, the president has frozen the activities of the parliament since July 2021. And there is, of course, a risk of an authoritarian backlash in Tunisia. In Algeria and Morocco, two authoritarian systems are seriously violating human rights. The regime are taking advantages of the crisis to imprison hundreds of journalists, activists, democracy activists, and the situation getting worse day by day. Special groups of society are more affected by the crisis than others, such as the poor, women, and minorities, like the Berber in Algeria and Morocco, or blacks, people from South Tunisia, or the Sahrawi population. Poor people and women are more likely to live cramped conditions with harsh options for regular hand washing and purchase of masks, etc. They are also more likely to live in multi-generational households, increasing the transmission risks to vulnerable elderly who cannot be isolated from interactions with others in their homes. Compared to white-collar jobs, the poor have no possibility for home office. It's also an important factor. They also have less access to treatment or vaccination, and to pay the costs for consultation or the expense of for treatment. We have a very for Tunisia a very risky situation. Tunisia's stability and democracy are characterized by a very large middle class, and after the COVID, we have the risk that 50% of this called middle class can go to the either poverty class, poor class. So I think we have, after the COVID, very complicated, not only economic situation, but also political situation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Rachid, for these insights into the Maghreb region. And I think it's really striking how, so to say, little conjunctural improvements over several years can crush in the multiple crises in this time of pandemics. And I think it's something we also have know from the data in Latin America and several countries, how poverty rates have increased enormously, and where especially the middle classes are under pressure in this sense. I think also the aspects of what you mentioned and your final reflections of authoritarian backlash and this link to the political regimes is very important, and probably this is also an aspect we'll see in our next presentation, where we speak especially also about inequalities in the context of biopolitics, political regimes intervening in birth control politics and Planned Parenthood. And here I would like to introduce, and we make a certain jump as we go to another region here, Eastern Central Europe, and in the midst of the 19th century. In this sense, I would like to introduce to you now Heidi Hein-Kircher from the Heidi Institute for Historical Research on East Central Europe. Heidi Hein-Kircher earned her MAD and PhD from Heinrich Heine University in Düsseldorf, working on the research staff of the Heidi Institute for Historical Research in East Central Europe. Since 2003, she has become the head of the department Academic Forum in 2009. In her research, she focuses on urban history of the 19th and 20th centuries in East Central Europe, in regard to modernization, knowledge transfer, and nationalization, as well as historical critical security and conflict studies. Specialized on East Central European history in the 19th and 20th century, she works with a focus on gender and family planning, and that's also the context she will present now her talk. And Heidi, the floor is yours.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Olaf. Thank you for your friendly introduction. And so I'm just jumping if my no, I have to do it with my mouse. Okay. In winter 2020, we could experience a second wave of protests in Poland. Despite the tense corona situation, thousands of women protested against the national conservative tightening of abortion law. Also, the rejection of a national conservative bill on tightening abortion law in Slovakia just a few weeks earlier point to the politicization of abortion law and thus to the relevance of family and family planning for societies as a whole. Family planning, according to the clinical dictionary, circumscribes the birth regulation to the self-determined use of methods of contraception, which is intended to enable the number of children and the regulation of pregnancy to be adapted to the individual wishes of a parent couple or mother in accordance with their respective circumstances. Since the Tehran Proclamation of International Conference on Human Rights of May 1968, family planning has been considered as a fundamental right of every couple since 1997 as a human duty. Although contraception and abortion are among the longest practiced interventions in human biological processes, it became a publicly negotiated topic since the last third of the 19th century. Hence, the modern understanding of family values and family planning received important impulses from the development of modern secularizing societies and the establishment and expansion of modern statehood. We can interpret it as a process which started during the Enlightenment and a process in which societies got more rationalized. The European understanding of family has changed to the nuclear family of 1 to 2 kids. And this is a normative form of life. This correlates with the role attributions of family members. Since then, the understanding of family planning has developed in the Euro-Atlantic societies under a very close reciprocal influence of modernization and secularization, of technical scientific innovations and transfer processes. Family planning matured as a highly politicized and secularized topic at the interface of state, society, and individuals into a transnational social conception of values and norms and into a political idea, and it was propagated in all political camps beyond the conservative clerical forces. At the same time, family has been more and more idealized and seen as the basis of the nation and as the nucleus of the state. In this understanding, social and political changes seem to be possible only by accessing families. In the course of this, family became not only the topos of diverse, emotionally and ideologically charged discourses, it reflected historically changing values, norms, and political ideas of order, but also overlapping identities in an equal measure. Using these premises, we have conceptualized our project comparing not only the given processes in Poland and the Czech lands, but other European states, Eastern European states too. Moreover, we want to put the regional developments into a broader transnational frame and show the influence of transnational networking and transnational knowledge exchange. So I would like now present the fundamental developments and some facets of this project by discussing several examples. First, I will outline the transfer of ideas that triggered the change in values and thus the debates on moral reform before 1914, and then discuss the interrelationship between the transfer of culture and the transfer of ideas in the interwar period, using the example of the Polish language Jewish women's magazine Eva. For framing, I refer a bit to German developments as the German birth control movement became the leading in interwar period. Then I will explain the establishment of a new set of values by the Soviet Union as a counter model to these developments. And this counter model has become very formative for all Eastern European societies since the post-war World War II area. In doing so, I start from the premise that the living conditions and forms of modernity led to special transfer processes, especially into the different European regions and states. Because, and the Eastern European states and societies had a very polycultural and polyethnic character, so these transfers were adapted after their necessities. So the discourses on the changing family structures reflect the development and changes in family images and they're coming from below as well as from above, from the nation, and of course they're culturally tinted. So I come now to my first example, breaking taboos. While mortality rates fell in the course of 19th century as a result of industrialization and urbanization, improved hygiene and ultimately also improved medical knowledge, the fertility rate fell with a certain time lag. With the perception of this development, debates about it began in France as early as in the 1960s, in Germany, who ruled partly over Poland in this time, and in England, it started around 1880, 1890. And a reflection was the rise of population policy in political circles. The fertility decline was debated publicly. Initially, new Malthusian ideas formed an important frame of reference for finding a way out of poverty and of an easing of life through birth control. The patterns of argumentation were extended in the long term from about 1910 onwards by eugenic and partly social Darwinists' argument. Birth control was practiced by broad sections of the population, and by 1914 had become a privately practiced matter of course everywhere in Europe, as Christine Diniel put it. If better off women had access to contemporary contraceptives, women from the lower classes had only abortion. The high abortion rates provoked population policies and penal measures. But above all, it set in motion very strong debates about birth control that were conducted with verve, so that the national movements had to define their relationship to the meaning of family and abortion in terms of their respective nation and in distinction from the others. Analogous processes could be observed, even with a certain delay, all over Europe. The resulting reform efforts were justified by discourses on morality, which initially focused primarily on criticism of the male double standards, prostitution, and, in the Polish case, especially in the trade in living goods. That means trafficking in women, breaking the taboo of concealment. Since healthy family and healthy nation were seen interdependent, abstinence for both sexes was initially propagated under the life reform slogan of purity. But it also entailed demands for conscious and wanted motherhood and the limitation of offspring. The connection of the moral reform movement with Polish nationalism is evident, for example, in a 1903 published paper by Antonia Sikorska on the fundamentals of modern girls' education, in which they emphasized that the family was seen as the foundation of the society and therefore the family shouldn't be immoral. The condition that our women are good mothers, wives, and citizens could be fulfilled only, in the eyes of Sikorska, if women lived hygienically and healthily, and marriage was, quote, first of all for society and for the child. The discourses broke hence a social taboo, at the same time acquiring a Polish tinge and laying the foundations for a change experienced all over Europe in values and norms. And this change was accelerated by First World War and, of course, by democratization in the post-war period. So I come to my second example. These approaches, which emerged already around 1910, were made more dynamic by the First World War and its political consequences. Throughout Europe, the new woman represented the dawn of democratic modernity, in which traditional social orders such as marriage and combined with it of compulsory birth were reviewed. The debates about birth control brought together the three concepts of new, freedom, and sexuality, which, according to Daniel Bell, laid the conceptual foundations for social change in the interwar period. The attitude towards compulsory childbearing was supported by numerous medical scientific findings and, conversely, stimulated research. Neo-Malthusian and eugenic arguments continued to influence the understanding of procreation, which was further rationalized. Particularly under the influence of the scientifically leading Berlin Institute for Sexual Science, founded in 1919, the transnational scientific community developed, for example, in Spain, Italy, and in the states of East Central Europe, founded in 1918. Thus, already after the first Congress for Sexual Reform, organized by its director Magnus Hirschfeld in 1921, rudiments of international coordination were discernible in the form of the World League for Sexual Reform, dissolved in 1932. In this reform, the American birth control movement under Margaret Sanger was very strongly involved, and she not a very tight net of transfer all over Europe. There, all over Europe, we find influences of these developments. An example of this transnational networking and this transnational reception are the Polish debates in the late 1920s. At that time, the debates about a new nationwide marriage and abortion law ignited discourses about birth control and family values, especially in left liberal circles, which the trained physician and publicist Tadeusz Bozielensky had fueled with its article in the Wiadomości Literackie in the literary novelties. Delayed in comparison to Western Europe, neo-Malthusian and eugenic arguments were woven into Polish debates beyond moral reform. In contrast to most Polish women's magazines, debates on birth control took up a considerable amount of space in the Jewish women's magazine, a Zionist magazine, Ever. Neo-Malthusian patterns of argumentation can be detected there, since only as many children should be born as this was the expressed wish of the parents. No woman, the member of parliament, Róża Meltzerowa, said, wants, say, a third child, much less a fourth or fifth, but children are loved all the more for that. Here, Meltzerowa refers to the changing image of families, even in very conservative Jewish families. Meltzerowa's contribution thus shows 2 points: the transfer and adaptation of knowledge and the discourses for this adaptation. And second, that this process produced at the same time various intersections and differences. In this example, the differences through which Jewish women were to come to a redefinition of their position as women and mothers. The last example is the replacement of old norms. With the Russian Revolution, the Bolsheviks' distaste for the family, ostracized as bourgeois, became very clear, especially since the new society was to be reflected in gender equality. The Soviet Union therefore took a very special path. In 1920, abortion was legalized and contraceptives were distributed freely of charge, which the women's rights activist Alexandra Kollontai, who became the first female minister, had pushed through despite conservative attitudes towards women's and family issues among the party leadership. According to Kollontai, it was not so much a matter of freeing women from the mind-numbing domestic economy, but primarily of freeing women's labor power for the construction of socialism. She was concerned with freeing women for the endless number of small jobs associated with raising children at home. Kollontai, therefore, saw the new family in the collective, so that the new woman should bear children but not raise them by herself. Only in this way, she argued, could be reached a fundamental change of the women's role in the societies. And therefore, socio-political measures, such as the establishment of concealing centers on methods of contraception and the introduction of maternity protection, accompanied this policy. Since the end of 1920s, the demographic and the economic consequences of this policy had been discussed. It had become very clear that the dissolution of the traditional family did not make any sense in terms of population policy. With the legalization of abortion, the Soviet Union had embarked on a very special path that was joyfully received everywhere in Europe, especially by communist groups. Communist representatives were still referring to this path at the beginning of the 1930s, when a recriminalization of abortion was already discussed in the USSR. The slogan used by some European abortion movements, "My body belongs to me," is derived from this influence, but it was used by all groups except for the right-wing and clerical groups. And this slogan was received in the Polish discourses too, for example in Ewa. But against the background of deportations and decolonialization, Soviet family policies appear very ambivalent since the beginning of the 1930s. On the one hand, the destruction of peasant families, on the other, a pro-natalist family policy with a ban on abortion in 1936, and the introduction of awards for childbearing mothers with more than 5 children in 1944. Due to the war casualties, however, moral standards loosened so that illegitimate births were no longer criticized. In 1956, abortion was finally freed again. And this was the same argumentation as in the early 1920s. Within the framework of the Soviet hegemony over Eastern Europe, the Sovietized states legalized abortion too. Only Romania delegalized it in 1966. An abortion culture emerged, which, according to Libor Stlutkal, resulted from political decisions and prevailing social values, but also had the practical reason that, unlike contraceptives, abortion remained free of charge. This, in turn, was countered by pro-natalist family policies, so that family planning was ultimately perceived as a part of the socio-economic plan rather than a free human right. Overall, attitudes toward marriage and the family were standardized from above by the Soviet Union or its satellites, and thus family values were Sovietized. Soviet policy ultimately designed a counter-model by leaving family planning to the individual woman, but creating a wide range of social institutions to maintain an ultimately pro-natalist policy. So I come to my conclusion. With regard to the understanding of family and family planning, rational, secularized, and at the same time individualized attitudes can be discerned since the 19th century. Due to their specific focus, family and family planning reflect changing societal values, norms, and thus concepts of order against the backdrop of the respective societal and political challenges. So family values, and particularly family planning, are a derived individual right, which could be seen as a reflection of prevailing and changing values and of social political challenges in the societies. So our approach seems to be appropriate to analyze this East Central European societies very deeply from a very specific point of view. So we can, and we hope we will find within the next month again some examples for the subjectivities and the self-empowerment of women before the self-empowerment wave in the 2020s. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Heidi, for this really insightful talk on Eastern European experience, and especially bringing in the gender dimension in social inequalities. And I think we have had a broad array, different talks, different dimensions of social inequality. And you know the procedure now. The floor is open for questions and comments. You can write your questions or comments either in the chat. You can use also the chat in the YouTube channels, or simply raise your hands as you like, your virtual Zoom hand, or literally your real hand, as you like. So, any questions, comments? Yeah, Jochen Kemner, please.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay, fine. Well, thanks a lot to all of you for your presentations and insights into your specific research outlet. I would like to relate your studies, especially on social inequalities, with the overarching objective of this conference, which is to examine possible limits or maybe pitfalls of academic knowledge production, and the fact that we often deal with concepts developed in the West or the North, however you will, and then apply them to the southern regions where we do our research and interact with colleagues. And I wonder how social inequality fits into this perspective. So, no, Sergio, you know, when we deal with Latin America, nearly every text begins with that this is the most unequal region in the world, and then we have some figures to measure if inequalities rises or declines, which governmental measures were successful or not. But do you see, and this is a question for all of you, that these kinds of measurements like the Gini index, which you've mentioned, are really appropriate to address these questions? And how do you, in your dialogues with colleagues in the African Mediterranean region, in Latin America, in Southern African region, or in Eastern Europe, have you any kind of discussions on how to label or how social inequalities is perceived? It's the same way as you perceive it in Europe from your perspective, or do you see any differences? This would be my question. Maybe all of you have kind of an answer.
So I think as it is a very big question, you can answer right now. I don't know. I saw a sign by Heidi. So Heidi, if you would like to start.
Okay. I have to put a very long story very short and very sharply. But no, inequalities, and this is what always plays an important role in our project, is very important, and we want to historicize them, and even the kind how the values developed resulting from the inequalities. We have not only gender inequalities in Eastern Europe, we have also inequalities between the different national groups, and this is really important. And I didn't mention it because it is really a high and very very important topic. For example, we have how the Czechoslovak state worked and sterilized forcefully Roma population until the 1960s. And this is really just because they said Roma are too much, they are poor, and of course they are stealing, and also the stereotypes were used. And this was the argumentation that why women were forcefully sterilized. And this is, for example, one part that we see in Eastern Europe. It is not only social inequality, gender inequality, it is also an ethnic inequality. And of course, it plays a role. And this is, it was one starting point for the project. We saw that the Tehran Proclamation by the end of 1960s said it is a human right, and this means by the UN, it was established by the UN, it is something accepted worldwide, particularly by the main powers within the UN in this time. So also the Soviet Union. But a deeper look shows that is, of course, it was a general agreement, even in Europe, and with European perceptions, and of course the church played an enormous role. And then a deeper look shows that of course we have a different understanding in this at this time at the Soviet Union, in the GDR, or in Poland. In comparison, for example, to Western Germany. So it reflects, and it is on different layers. We are discussing these perspectives, and of course that we are coming from a Western European point of view regarding these questions, but we can see and we observe it in the self-empowerment. It led, even at this times, it led to kind of self-empowerment of women. And of course, it is now very obvious in the Polish case, in the Slovakian case, but also if you remember the Turkish case a few months ago. And it is because abortion and the family number of kids is such important for an understanding of families today in modern societies, or modern embossed societies. And it is, of course, and it would be really fantastic to find a global perspective after our project. If we have something conceptualized for European societies as a whole.
I think that would really be interesting, because actually in Latin America, especially in the Andean region, but also in Middle America, Central America, there are several experiences on these forced sterilization programs, and also recent debate in Peru on that. But I would hand over now to Sergio.
Yeah, thank you, Olaf, and also thank you, Jochen, for this really instigating question. You are absolutely right. So you see also inequalities in research on inequalities in terms of region, inequalities in terms of perspective, which group has the power for defining what's inequality, if saying, let's say, inequalities between whites and black is a relevant issue or not. This is, of course, also an issue which also depends on power correlations and so on. So to be concrete in the answer, I think there are some cases in which you have indeed a disparity between social reality and scholarship. If you take, at least in my field of sociology, the sociology in the 90s in Latin America were very much specialized in discussing a new word, as described, I don't know, by authors such as Interregional, Ulrich Beck, or even Habermas. While in the region, poverty and increasing inequalities were actually at the stake, but informed by this sort of scholarship, the most of us, and I include me also in this group, were more interested in an agenda which was not really the socially relevant agenda for the region. And you have also disparities in terms of recognition of the scholarship. If you look at the scholarship on intersectionality, so you know authors such as Rodolphe Sternhagen. From the 50s, Rodolphe Sternhagen in Mexico has studied intersections between ethnicity and class for defining inequalities. Or if you look at Brazil, Florestan Fernandes is studying intersectionalities between class and race, or Safiotti studying intersectionality between gender and class for defining inequalities. And a colleague, Elizabeth Helin from Argentina, worked on this issue about the invisibility of this research, this previous research and current debates on intersectionality. You see, this is not only anecdotal evidence, this is a really hard evidence that there is a sort of disparity within within scholarship on inequality. So, but to conclude with a sort of more positive aspect, I think that research on inequality has changed, not only in Latin America, but especially in Latin America, in that way that including everyday experiences, including cultural responses to inequality, are more and more part of inequality research. Not only the sort of global indicators such as index, Gini index, or other indicators, which I think they are very important also for comparison, for showing a sort of position of certain country in the global picture. But of course, also the social experience with inequality is also quite relevant for understanding dynamics of inequality. But I think this is more and more part of the scholarship on inequality research. I don't know if it's possible. I don't see Andreas Eckert there, because I have a question that could be interesting to be discussed also in transregional terms. So the impressive picture Andreas Eckert traced in his presentation, led me to ask about the role of China. So China as a sort of presence in Africa, which is similar to Latin America, and not saying using China sort of a scapegoat, but of course the whole description of development trajectory, even if it's wrong, if it's an illusion, but was based on the idea that these countries could be industrialized. But the presence in China, both in Africa and Latin America, is exactly the opposite message, saying, look, you are importers of our product, and you are interested only in your primary goods. So this could be perhaps a very interesting issue to be discussed from a transregional perspective. But I don't know if Andreas Eckert is...
Andreas is unfortunately had to leave for an urgent meeting in his faculty. But
the question remains.
Yeah. Probably, we have here a question in the chat from Lisa Marie Meyer. Do you want to read? Do you want to raise your question, or shall I read it out?
You can read it out, thank you.
Okay. How would you assess the, it's a question to Heidi, how would you assess the current narrative of ideological colonization by right-wing forces in post-Soviet regions when it comes to the abortion debate? the entanglement of Western resentment and appropriation of colonization discourse and increasing anti-abortion stances seem to make women's self-empowerment gradually more difficult on a political discursive level. And probably I would add myself to the list to a broader question and probably a more general one, which is linked. We spoke a lot about social inequality, and this question of Lisa Maria also goes into the direction of political, so to say, struggle, because obviously from Marxist analysis, social inequality is linked to the idea of class struggle and actually conflict in a certain way and political movement in a certain way. And I think also Rachid raised this question. So how do we think social inequality in regard to political participation, especially as we see the different layers of social inequalities in plural, and on the other hand, the increasing social disparities in terms of Gini index of distribution of wealth. I think Heidi first has the word, and then we go. The last question is more general one.
Okay. Perhaps I'm starting with the second part of this question, and thank you for that. To my mind, we see that the political situation in Poland wouldn't have provoked such great demonstrations, such as the black demonstrations of the women. And it is a time when the women went on the street, and some of the males went on the street, when the former demonstrations against the juridical reforms were less important for Polish society. And then it is really and these black demonstrations, they show us that there are a lot of people, and these aren't only people or women who did abortions. These are normal family mothers who see it is a personal right and perceive it as personal right, and we don't want that the state tightened it. And of course, it is a political narration by the leading party of peace, Prawo i Sprawiedliwość, but it is for peace. It fits into the scheme of anti-European narration they created. And this is why I think it is so important to historicize these processes. And we see, and this is really important to acknowledge, we see all over Europe a fertility decline in the 1900s, with a delay in Eastern Europe with regard to France, who started around 1800, and it was observed in Great Britain, in Germany, and so on and so on. But all over Europe, it is something like that. And it is a kind of modernization, of rationalization of societies, and of secularization. And the anti-abortion and the abortion discourses, or for legalizing discourses, abortion legalizing discourses in Poland were in the 1920s really, really strong. And there the Catholic Church didn't play any role. Today it is vice versa. And this is one point where I would say it is now a kind of political play. The peace needs the support of the church, and vice versa again. And it's a politicization. And the historic perspective allows us to show that, of course, we have a kind of change, because of different society challenges, but it is also interwoven with a European phenomenon. And so I would say it is really a narration, this part of the leading piece, and a narration. This is for them, this is an instrument to gain and not to gain, to hold power.
Probably the broader reflection on political participation, protest, and social inequality. Maybe Rachid, you want to say something on that, as you worked on youth movements on the Arabian Spring, and I think this could be a good question for you.
I think the question is, Jochen, is so important for the debates on the definition of inequality in the Maghreb, because the first legitimacy of these countries after the independence is to build an egalitarian society or egalitarian states. So this, but let me see the inequality or inequalities weren't so visible until the 90s with the implementation of neoliberal policies, and of course the role of the media, and show that every Maghrebian citizen knows in which situation he is. He has the possibility now to compare with the situation, not only with in his neighborhood or but also to Europe. And this, I think, this position to be next to the next neighbor to Europe influences this debate of inequality more than other regions in the world, because short of the migration have millions of migrants from North Africa in Europe, especially in France, but also this you have new access to knowledge, and it's very we have very interesting situations with the confinement shutdown and with the COVID. When France declared a confinement, in the next day you have confinement in the 3 countries of the Maghreb. It's crazy. And when France declared confinement between 20 midnight until the morning, because in France it's okay, because the peoples are going to the discotheque, etc. in the night. But it's not the case in the Maghreb. Even the governments declare the same thing. Yeah, so they have, of course, this power of definition, and it's or what do you mean social distanciation? It's impossible to do social distanciation in the Maghreb. It's really impossible. And the governments they build kind of consultation commissions, like with Angela Merkel and the doctors and specialists of microbiology and I don't know what. They do the same thing in the Maghreb, and you have no results. But when they include religious people in this commission, you have better results when the government communicate the plan how to for combating COVID, etc., like social distancing. It's a very remarkable development, and you are right. Now we have, Sergio said that with the very visible presence of Chinese economy, China in the Maghreb, I think we can have another situation in the definition of inequalities, because and it's a very interesting debate. Because you have no really a debate on equality, or another debate on equality in China, and I think I'm not sure, but let's wait which influence could have this Chinese influence on inequality in North Africa.
Yeah, thank you. We have begun just at this moment the discussion, and we have to interrupt it. Let you know for time reason. If you, Sergio, do you have a short intervention?
Yes, thank you. Just to address your quite interesting question on political participation and inequality, which is actually also labeled our discussion. Therefore, I think just address very briefly this aspect. So, of course, this some classical distinction between civic, political, and social rights, as defined by Marshall, really doesn't work. But I think in the case of democratization of Latin America, it somehow worked in that sense that after citizens had some political rights, they could also apply and claim for social rights. And this, in a certain moment of recent Latin American history, led to a reduction of inequality, especially in the so-called pink time, so the period of leftist and middle leftist governments in Latin America. But then you are the expert on this, Olaf. Of course, this only works if states are not captured by elites. In case of Latin American states, most of them are captured by elites. So even if you have political participation and also citizens voting and so on, at the end, the state is already captured by elites. And this is one of the very interesting theses developed by Olaf. So in this situation, having political rights not necessarily lead to less inequality. So very brief, of course, a huge...
Thank you. I think we recently we showed the potential for transregional discussions of this topic. And really, as you talked about bridging in research, Sergio, you really made the bridge for our final interregional discussion, because actually this capture of the state by elites and the new social formation raising from that obviously is a topic raised by Sikat Neckel. But we now have a short break of 10 minutes. Or not even 10 minutes, 7 minutes. So at 6:15 German time, we will come back and we finish the transmission right now and start in 7 minutes. So thank you all for this participation in this panel, and see you later. Welcome back to the interregional dialogue in this session on social inequalities and political exclusion. In this dialogue right now, we explore different perspectives and approaches in the research on social inequalities. We juxtapose an approach based on intersectionality that is adjusted and transformed by specific Latin American debates, with an approach that analyzes recent capitalist developments as a conjuncture of refeudalization. So let me start first and let me introduce to you Mara Viveros Vigoya. Mara Viveros is a doctor in anthropology from the School of Higher Studies in Social Sciences of Paris, with a master in Latin American Studies also in Paris, and she is also an economist at the National University of Colombia. Actually, she is a titular professor of the Faculty of Human Sciences of the National University of Colombia. She has taught and developed a good part of her research projects in the Department of Anthropology and the School of Gender Studies, where she was director several years. She also has been visiting professor to diverse research institutions and universities in Europe and Latin America. And in this sense, she also has been a member of the Social Science School of the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton University. And I may add, she has been a fellow at Colors, our research center. Recently, she also has been president of the Latin American Studies Association, LASA. And I would now like to give her the word with a talk, I think basically on the approach of intersectionality and its impacts for social inequality research from a very adjusted Latin American perspective. So from the center to the margins, decolonial intersectionality. Mara, you have the word, and I remind you that you all can choose the translation with the globe button, as Mara will speak in Spanish, I think.
Bueno, muchas gracias, querido Olaf.
Okay, thank you very much, dear Olaf. I will just briefly say some words in English out of courtesy for the rest of the guests.
Of this conference. And in particular, in this interregional dialogue with the Professor Mecila. This will not only be an interregional dialogue, but also an interlinguistic one, as I will take advantage of the translation to speak more comfortably in my mother tongue, Colombian Spanish. Bueno, eso era para...
All right, so that was a bit of introductory words, and also put myself out there to be able to reach you closer. And now I will talk about this presentation, from the center to the margins. I also presented a PowerPoint presentation. I haven't really tried it, so if it works immediately, I will use it. If not, I will just speak directly without a presentation. So let's try. I will try showing my screen and see if it's possible.
Entonces vamos a comenzar efectivamente.
So we will start from the center to the margins, decolonial intersectionality. So in this presentation, I will propose a reflection on the journey that intersectionality has had in a double direction as a theoretical, methodological, and political perspective. From the moment the term was coined in 1991, by Kimberly Crenshaw, through the academic popularization of the term, which was later acquired after the World Conference Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance, which was held in South Africa in the year 2001, to what it has happened and intensified in the last decade, in which feminism has been at the forefront as a political party and movement, and it has massified and at the same time resignified the concept of the margin. So I will start very briefly talking about genealogies of intersectional thinking. For some years now, intersectionality has become the term to designate the theoretical and methodological perspective that seeks to account for the intersecting or overlapping perception of power relations. This approach has already been pointed out by Sergio Costa. It's not new within the Latin American feminisms. And in fact, there is now an agreement to point out on one side that the feminist theories had already addressed the problem before giving it a name. And secondly, that the problem of exclusions created by the use of theoretical frameworks that ignore the imbrication of power relations had been circulating for a long time in diverse historical and geopolitical contexts. This ignorance was challenged by Black women in the United States through different organizations that fought for the abolition of slavery and at the same time for the right to vote for Black people, and against the lynching of Black men and racial segregation. In the last quarter of the 20th century, proposals emerged, such as those of the Combahee River Collective, which published in the year 1977 extraordinary formulation of the problematic of intersectionality in the document entitled Black Feminist Declaration. In this document of the Combahee River Collective, they define their political action around an active commitment of struggle, and I will quote them, against racial, sexual, heterosexual, and class oppression. And, once again, I will quote, to develop an integrated analysis and practice based on the fact that the major systems of oppression are intertwined. This notion of intertwined dynamics. Well, these new feminism, for example, has other forefront authors such as Angela Davis, Bell Hooks, Michelle Ballas, June Jordan, and Audre Lorde, among the best known. The meaning of the unity of feminism, converting the differences between women into power, and an enriching of their common projects and struggles. While this was happening in North America, various activists and intellectuals, Afro-Brazilian ones such as Teresa Santos, Lelia Gonzalez, Maria Beatriz do Nascimento, y Luisa Bajos, as well as Jurema Werneck and Sueli Carneiro, among others, promoted the theory of the triad of oppressions, race, class, gender, which the dominant feminist discourse of the time had tried to ignore as a subject of debate within the Communist Party of Brazil. I will dwell briefly on the proposals that two of them made in the 80s. On one side, by the Afro-Brazilian sociologist and activist Lelia Gonzalez, and on the other hand, the philosopher Sueli Carneiro. And I will do this for two reasons. One of the reasons is the relevance and the validity of their thinking, and because they are rarely included in the genealogy of intersectional thinking and praxis. Of course, we must talk about Scioti and many other intellectuals that articulated reflections on classism and sexism. However, they both are very important in what we call intersectionality because they also introduce race as a topic. Gonzalez reflected on the importance of recognizing and linking struggles against classism, sexism, and racism, and she identified the need to produce localized knowledges that would confront what later Aníbal Quijano theorized as the coloniality of knowledge. Likewise, Leila Gonzalez criticized the founding narrative of Latin American societies that had prioritized Latinidad, meaning the link of this Latin America with Europe, and at the same time silencing the importance of the historical existence and overall of the political agency, both or the past, present, and future ones of Black and Indigenous peoples. Lelia Gonzalez named the territory in which we live as America Latina, realizing that this America was always more Amerindian and African than Latin, and so created the political cultural concept of Americanidad as a counterpoint to the hegemonic US discourse on Black identity in the Americas. When we think about the Black identity in the Americas, we were always thinking about it in US terms, and that's why I think it's interesting to talk about America Latina, to talk about these Black identities in this region of the world. Sueli Carneiro, for her part, was one of the first to argue that if feminism was to emancipate all women, it would include the experience of Black women. It had to confront all forms of oppression, and not only those based on gender, as an axis of oppression that could separate race from class. Her work unveiled the illusion of a world shaped by an abstract universalism and a hierarchical and binary social organization of gender and race based on colonial sexual violence. He also, Sueli Carneiro, enriched and empowered the feminist political scene and agenda with anti-racist banners of struggle. Carneiro was also the first to propose the use of the term Afro-descendant as a word with a social, cultural, and political connotation to generate cohesion and a common political identity. Her proposal was accepted by the majority of the regional academia, and it was definitely incorporated into the UN terminology at the Durban Conference in the year 2001. The description of these contributions allows us to affirm that, although this reflection is not new, what is new about it in relation to intersectionality is the way in which it has circulated in recent times, in different academic and political contexts, as one of the key approaches to contemporary discussions and struggles around difference, diversity, and plurality, with multiple effects as we will see now. And overall, due to this structure between diversity, difference, plurality, and social inequality, which is the topic that is gathering us today. So let's see, what is the path of intersectionality from the margin to the center? Well, the concept of intersectionality as such was coined by US jurist Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989 in the context of discussing a specific legal case at the US company General Motors as a tool aimed at overcoming the legal invisibility of the multiple dimensions of oppression experienced at the time by Black women in the labor world. Intersectionality, she wrote, designates the various ways in which race and gender interact to shape multiple dimensions of Black women in the labor world. With this notion, Crenshaw expected to highlight the fact that Black women in the US were exposed to violence and discrimination on the basis of both race and gender. And overall, she sought to create concrete legal categories that would allow her to address discrimination on multiple and varied levels. She was referring specifically to the court's rejection of the claim of 5 Black female workers that had pointed out that the General Motors seniority system discriminated against them. Crenshaw argued that the court's refusal to recognize this combined race and sex discrimination was based on the limits of the definition of sex and race discrimination based on, respectively, the experiences of white women and Black men to talk about sex discrimination, and Black men to talk about combined race discrimination. In this way, the specific subjective experience of Black women workers remained hidden. Since then, Kimberly Crenshaw has clarified that her application of intersectionality has been and continues to be contextual and practical, and that her aim has never been to create a general theory of oppression, but rather a concept of practical use for analyzing specific legal omissions and inequalities. A decade after coining the term, Kimberly Crenshaw participated in the preparation of the World Conference Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance by giving a seminar on the concept of the Preparatory Committee in Geneva in 2000. From this moment on, the intersectional perspective, whether under the name of intersectionality or other equivalent terms, began to take hold and to expand globally. During this World Conference held in Durban in the year 2001, more than 10,000 delegates adopted the term in the gender section of the document that was signed by the non-governmental organization forum of this first conference, and I will quote it. An intersectional approach to discrimination recognizes that every person, whether male or female, exists within a framework of multiple identities, which are determinants of experiences of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. An intersectional approach highlights how there is a simultaneous interaction of discrimination as a result of these multiple identities. After this World Conference, Crenshaw's work was used in the drafting of the, for example, Equality Clause of the South African Constitution, and it also marked a turning point in the institutionalization of the concept in international diplomacy and gained, of course, academic notoriety. In this way, the concept of intersectionality born out of a marginal and contested context, which is the one I quoted before when I talked about the declaration of the Combahee River Collective, gradually became a broad and widely used concept in these different fields. In particular, it is worth noting the use that the UN has made of this approach since then to refer to women's rights as human rights and to the diversity of women in very heterogeneous geographical, social, and cultural contexts, such as those of Latin America and the Caribbean. However, it is also important to highlight that the same thing has happened with intersectionality as happened with the gender approach during the 90s, the decade of the great international conferences of the 20th century. On the one hand, it has brought an undeniable recognition of intersectionality in the academic world and a greater commitment of governmental bodies to the fight against multiple discrimination, which has led to important advances in the formulation of their public policies. Paradoxically, however, the institutionalization of the concept has resulted as well in the category and a rhetoric use of this concept as a standard and decontextualized from this and detached from its original political imprint. If by saying intersectionality, the feminist discourse remains intact, if the argument, the analysis, and the intersectional approach consist only of applying feminist truths from above to the understanding of the world of women from below, imagining that all inequalities are exacerbated by an additive logic, we are then understanding what intersectionality is all about in a very wrong way. Intersectionality points us towards a new form of interpretation that moves away from a purely gendered feminist viewpoint to a more comprehensive one. The blend of these main critical systems of interpretation of the social order, and I'm referring to Marxism, feminism, critical race theory, is that each has claimed to offer an interpretation of the social world on the basis of what it assumes to be the primary axis of inequality from which the others are derived. It also assumes that each axis is autonomous, ignoring the fact that in the configuration of inequalities, their interrelation is constitutive. Intersectionality is neither the problem nor the solution to social inequalities. It is only a perspective that highlights them and an interpretative framework that breaks down hierarchies and competitions between axes of inequalities and that calls for the establishment of political alliances. In this sense, the analytical and political scope of intersectionality will depend on how the concept is used and for which purposes. And fortunately, in recent years, some aspects of this traveling nature of the notion of intersectionality have brought about a certain repoliticization of the concept, as we shall see in the last section of this intervention.
Margen, descolonizar la interseccionalidad. Como suele ocurrir con las teorías viajeras,
as is often the case with traveling theories, and I'm thinking of Edward Said's definition, intersectionality has taken on new meanings and in a way has even been reinvented. but this has been done outside of the perimeter of universities, on the streets, and in social movement struggles. In Argentina and Brazil, the notion of intersectionality has been used to articulate and connect the movements of indigenous and Black women. In rural and metropolitan communities, among sexual minorities and women living in slums, without losing sight of their specificity in each case. And so in this América Latina, Latin America, and we see that is marked by long historical processes such as colonization, which have generated situations of exclusion and thinking. And so we must look at intersectional political thinking, and action has been linked to decolonial political thinking and action. This means that it has not limited itself to noting considering the multiplicity and complexity of the discriminations that characterize the experience of Latino African women, but on the contrary, has sought to understand the historical roots of these discriminations and to combat what they have produced. This appropriation and these uses of intersectionality have prompted a repoliticization of the notion, where what is at stake, and I will here quote Angela Davis, is not so much the intersectionality of identities, but rather the intersectionality of struggles. Some works, such as those of Flavia Rios, point to the emergence of a new generation of feminist activism, bearers of a new language of contestation, which express more clearly, such as in the case of Brazil, articulations between feminism and anti-racism in the public sphere, with a view to problematize the multiple forms of social oppression. Their adoption of intersectionality as a language goes beyond their understanding of the relevance of this tool of social and political interpretation. The term has become a category of collective political identity, emerging in the context of the transformations of the public sphere and the dynamics of feminist and anti-racist movements, especially amongst feminists who question the limits of more traditional political activism. It is from this point of view that we have a different interpretation of the meaning of the term. It's now not only an analytical category, but also a category of native use that marks the contemporary language of political mobilizations, the forms of naming, and the values that guide the collective actions of those who make the politics of the streets and networks. Thus, the term has ceased to be a noun to adjectivize. It adjectivizes a new type of feminist belonging, and, above all, a new way of conceiving feminism itself. And so, this is a new type of feminist thought and practice on new value bases. These transversal struggles are forging new spaces of convergence and fostering new forms of solidarity, where intersectionality has become a kind of method for multiplying encounters and countering any ossification of identity politics. While identity politics has played an effective role in opening up new fields of struggle, there is always a risk that it become an obstacle to developing broader processes of subjectivation and building a more effective basis for struggles against exploitation and oppression. The reinvention of intersectionality as an intersectionality of struggles, using Angela Davis's words, seemed to prefigure a new politics of solidarity. A politics of solidarity that is no longer based on vague assumptions of sisterhood or images of complete identification of some women with others, but rather looking at political and ethical goals. This is an intersectionality that allows for the construction of imagined communities Now, not so much around sex or color as inherent or natural characteristics, but around ways of thinking about race, class, and gender. This return to the margin of intersectional political thought and action is, and then let me paraphrase Bell Hooks, when she invites us to choose the margin of a space of radical openness. Bell Hooks draws a clear distinction between marginality imposed by oppressive structures and marginality chosen as a place of resistance, as a space for radical openness and possibility. This space for resistance is a critical response to domination and a space forged through struggle. We know, Bell Hooks says, that the struggle is difficult, it's challenging, and it's rough. But we also know that struggle is what pleases, delights, and satisfies desire. With Bell Hooks, we can imagine the space of intersectional struggles as a radical creative space that affirms and sustains our subjectivity and gives us a new place from which we can articulate our sense of the world. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mara, for your fascinating talk on the concept of intersectionality. I think that it's very interesting how you showed this idea of traveling concepts. And we look at how these ideas are appropriated by intellectuals and the academic sector, but also by different political struggles. And how, in this appropriation, we see enormous transformation, transculturalization, hybridization, until something completely new is created. So I think this is fascinating.
Now I will switch to English and to other uses of other creative concepts in social research. And I think one of the recently very creative concepts is that of refeudalization with an analysis by Sibylla. And I would like to introduce him right now to you. Sibylla is professor of sociology at the Department of Social Sciences at the University of Hamburg and spokesperson of the Humanities Center for Advanced Studies, Futures of Sustainability. Before taking his chair at Hamburg University, he held professorships for sociological theory at the Goethe University Frankfurt and the University of Vienna, and was research director at the Frankfurt Institute for Social Research, the famous one. He took up visiting professorships in the UK, South Korea, Japan, Australia, Poland, Switzerland, and Greece. And his research covers a wide range of sociological topics in the field of social inequality, which we are discussing right now, economic sociology, cultural studies, social theory, and sociology of emotions. And now we listen to him, to his analysis of recent transformations of modern or postmodern capitalism. So we will go on a voyage back to the future, the refeudalization of modern capitalism.
Yes, thank you very much for this kind introduction. I would like to share my screen. Can you see my screen now?
Yes, fine, perfectly.
Okay. Okay, here we are. Yes, thank you very much for inviting me to this interesting conference. I'm very pleased to be part of this interesting conference. As a sociologist, I'm not a specialist on Latin America, but focus on social inequality and the economics of modern capitalism. In this regard, I would like to present an analytical perspective on social change, which seems to be important for today's development in some Latin America countries too, the refeudalization of modern capitalism. I really appreciate that our colleague Olaf Kaltmeier has taken up this analytical concept in recent years to analyze social transformations in Latin American countries. In my talk, I want to explain the sociological foundations of this theory of refeudalization and relate it to global developments of social inequality. To be more precisely, I will refer to this analytical concept as originally introduced by Jürgen Habermas in his famous study on the structural transformation of the public sphere, originally published in 1962. Refeudalization is a term that plays an important role in Habermas' inquiry how the public sphere in bourgeois society lost its democratic qualities through the monopolization of economic and political power. By generalizing refeudalization for the sociological investigation of modern capitalism on the whole, I try to describe a paradoxical mode of social change that leads to pre-modern societal patterns as a result of modernization. In my talk, will proceed as follows. So first, I will discuss refeudalization within the context of Habermas' theory of the public sphere. Secondly, I will explain how to use refeudalization as an analytical term in sociology for several societal developments in present-day capitalism. As an empirical field, I will refer to the transformations of social inequality today, which lead, I think, to pre-modern types of social stratification at the bottom of the social structure, as well at the very top of the social hierarchy. At the end of my talk, I will present some sociological conclusions concerning the modes of social changes in modern capitalism in general. So let me begin with Habermas' theory of the public sphere. Habermas regards the public sphere in bourgeois society ideally as a political space which mediates between the state and society and which allows for equal participation by all citizens in the public debate over matters of general concern and political rule. This contrasts with the feudal system in which public referred to the visible representation of rule and public authority was not separated from the private sphere of the court. The public sphere thus originally emerged as a realm that placed limits on the personal power of monarchs. According to Habermas, however, the use of the public sphere for private interests based on economic calculations already began in the 19th century with the rise of the business press. In the course of this process, the public representation of personal power returns as a public relation of economically powerful private persons who represent their particular interests as general ones. As a result, a modern form of state representation develops that Habermas calls the refeudalization of the public sphere, because a return of the privatization of public space occurs within bourgeois society itself. Therefore, we can follow Habermas in speaking of refeudalization wherever the economic power of individuals translates seamlessly into domination of the public sphere, so that private interests determine how matters of general concerns are negotiated. In Habermas, it is the formation of economic monopolies that allows older pre-bourgeois forms of power to force their way back into the public arena. Today, Google, Apple, Facebook, and Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, and other regions of big data are extreme examples how private empires of digital media power gain far-reaching political influence. Facebook, for example, is used by 3 billion people across the world, but is controlled by one single individual. Those developments in the contemporary media power are also signals for current problems of democracy and the social structure as a whole. Therefore, the central thesis of my talk is that Habermas' concept of refeudalization has a renewed topicality. In the course of a neoliberal modernization of economy and society, numerous sectors of society are undergoing a transformation that is re-establishing pre-modern hierarchies and power structures. This is not a matter of a relapse into earlier times. In the analytical model of refeudalization, sociological time frames become intertwined. The new is not simply the result of linear processes of modernization. Instead, it arises within processes of social transformation that allow the old to emerge as the new and to reinvent traditional patterns of social order in highly modern forms. Therefore, refeudalization is a much more complex procedure than a return to the past. However, the dominant models of social change and social theory oppose the assumptions of progressive change, for example, in the theory of modernization, with evidence of regressive processes of social decline, for example, in the older Frankfurt School of Critical Theory. By contrast, I want to show that the distinction between progressive and regressive changes in capitalism needs to be replaced with much more complex models of paradoxical social change. I understand refeudalization in this context as an example of social change involving a paradoxical form of modernization at the heart of modern capitalism. Hence, capitalist modernization as refeudalization involves a process of counter-movement, like a transmission in reverse gear that carries an object forward by moving backward. In cinema, such counter-movement is familiar as a so-called dolly zoom or the vertigo effect, because this effect was first used by Alfred Hitchcock in his 1950 film Vertigo. The vertigo effect is produced by physically moving the camera toward an object while simultaneously zooming back from it and holding the image frame constant. This gives rise to a powerful visual pull effect, as though the viewer were being drawn into the frame, which Hitchcock used as a cinematic expression of the fear of heights of his main actor, James Stewart. It is this vertigo effect of social change that interests me here. The analytical perspective of refeudalization of capitalist modernity is instructive for the study of social change as a whole, whether this involves the erosion of the public sphere through the privatization of media power or transformation processes in other domains of present-day capitalism. Accordingly, processes of refeudalization can be seen as occurring in at least 3 dimensions of the current social order. First, with regard to a change in social inequality, which involves the polarization of incomparable social positions. Second, with regard to financial markets and the status enjoyed by their management elite, which do not operate as businessmen, but in fact as rentiers. And third, as a refeudalization of the welfare state, which is reprivatizing public social policy as donations and is transforming claims to social welfare into dependence on private charity. Limitations of time prevent me from covering all these points in this talk. Instead, I will concentrate on the first dimension mentioned, the social structure and recent changes in social inequality. Over the past 3 decades, numerous capitalist countries have experienced developments in social inequality which exhibits clear signs of refeudalization. Characteristic features of this development are the extremely one-sided preferential treatment of those at the pinnacle of society. These social elites enjoy historically unprecedented levels of wealth, while the lower strata are not only pauperized, but are increasingly exposed to relations of work that no longer satisfy the elementary standards of modern contractual relationships. Present-day forms of organization of work are often decoupled from the norms of equality before the law on a global scale. This is a transnational mass phenomenon, for example, in the household work service sector. In particular, in the huge global labor segment of the so-called global care chain, in which women leave their poorer countries of origin to perform care and domestic work in the richer countries, employer-employee relationships have become transformed into personal relations of dependencies that regress behind all of the historical advances of modern society in the allocation of rights. Similarly, drastic forms of unfree labor are familiar from the vast army of industrial migrant workers, especially from Asia, Africa, and some Latin American countries. In China, migrant workers are building the new mega cities. In the Arab Emirates, they toil on the construction sites as workers without passports. And in India, they are among the estimated 20 million people who live in personal debt bondage. Thus, experts from human rights organizations such as the Walk Free Foundation and the International Labour Office agree that work slavery is flourishing once again and is assuming previously unheard of dimensions in the modern era of globalization. While research in social science estimates that about 35 million people are living under lawless conditions based on violence that resemble slavery, the International Labour Office estimated that 25 million people throughout the world are victims of forced labor. According to these estimates, there are more forced laborers in the world in the 21st century than at any time in human history. Forced labor and human trafficking, extreme forms of labor exploitation, but also modern forms of debt bondage also exist in Western countries. In the meat industry, coal mines, the construction industry, home-based care, low-skilled services, and the agricultural sector, Forms of lawlessness and personal control have become established in labor relations of Western firms that round counter to all modern standards of legal freedom in entering the labor market. This has become a new dumping ground of the modern working society in which earnings no longer provide a living wage and personal instead of contractual relations of dependence exist. The return of unfree labor represents the most negative forms of refeudalization at the bottom of the social hierarchy. By contrast, the refeudalization of today's economic upper classes is assuming no less unbourgeois forms. At the very top of social structure, a new oligarchy of wealth has arisen based on a historically unique increase in personal wealth. This unprecedented prosperity is not a function of modern economic principles such as performance, competitions, and market success, as would accord with the self-understanding of a bourgeois social order, but of strategies for securing privileges that have their origins in pre-capitalist times. Let us take as an example the development of the leading incomes in the management sector. Even in the United States, the ratio of the income of CEOs to the average salaries of workers in their companies in the mid-60s, 1960s, was 20:1. Over the last decade, the so-called CEO pay ratio in the US has increased up to 300 times the average salary. A similar development has taken place in European countries that still see themselves as so-called social market economies. Thus, last year, the board members of the 30 largest listed companies in Germany received on average 50 times as much as the average employee of the companies. Compared to the past 3 decades, this is an increase of 150%. If we inquire into the causes of these immense gains, we will find that there is no single economic factor that could account for this surge in the earnings of top management, such as dramatically increasing differences in their performance or a sudden rise in their productivity. The top incomes are not based on pay for performance. They are instead an expression of the increased power of the executive and supervisory boards of joint stock companies to extract far more revenue from their companies than any top managers could contribute through their own performance. The rules governing the exercise of such economic power are generally known as rent-seeking behavior because it is a matter of extracting high incomes from companies without contributing anything in return. The payment of such rents and privilege benefits led to the unique increase in wealth at the top of society that is also changing the structure of social inequality as a whole. Just as neoliberalism led to the corrosion of guaranteed entitlements among lower earners in the penthouse of the social hierarchy, such entitlements were created on a massive scale. While lower social strata are exposed to deregulated labor markets, numerous institutions were created for the top earners with established guaranteed claims to maximum income. The privilege of being able to draw rents without contributing anything in return is not the only factor that is currently leading to a kind of feudal capitalism and a new gilded age, as this has become known in international inequality research. Other factors involved in refeudalization are directly political in nature. In most Western countries, massive tax cuts on capital gains, inheritances, and high incomes have been awarded over the past 30 years. Thus, the preferential treatment accorded a global wealthy class is the result of a kind of a political gift economy for the wealthy. It is not bourgeois capitalist principles such as performance and competition then that determine incomes and wealth, but social status, economic power, and political favors. Together, these developments are leading to a situation in which present-day modern societies are once again exhibiting levels of social inequality that existed in the early 19th century, as Thomas Piketty has shown. Thomas Piketty speaks in this context of the return of patrimonial capitalism based on a hyper-concentration of capital in the hands of a new oligarchical wealthy class. In this patrimonial society, dynastic structures of economic power are developing in which inheritance and marriage once again play a preeminent role, and in which those who come into possession of great wealth have revenues that one could never acquire through education, work, and performance. Viewed in a long-term historical perspective, one of the paradoxical aspects of this social change is that today the wealthiest segment of the economic bourgeoisie is now trying in turn to secure its position with the same means of rent extraction and inherited dynastic power as the aristocratic upper class once did. This neo-feudal economic position is bound up with the increase in political power which the upper classes use to safeguard their economic interests. This combination of economic and political power in the hands of the new oligarchy of wealth brings back to life a pre-modern formation of social classes in which there was as yet no separation between the spheres of politics and the market, or between law and economics. The merit, I think, of Jürgen Habermas' study of the structural transformation of the public sphere is that he showed with reverence to the refeudalization of the public how capitalism, in the course of its modernization, can lose the normative traits that set it apart as something historical new. We can thus gain a better understanding, I think, of both the current pauperization of work and the return of extreme forms of exploitation, as well as the emergence of new oligarchies and the growth of dynastic power, if we analyze these extreme forms of social change in terms of a theory of refeudalization. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Eckert, for this very instructive talk. And I just would like to begin the debate and really make it a debate in asking you one question. On one hand, I would like to ask Eckert how intersectional approaches are related to understand the process of refeudalization that you analyzed. Especially obviously in the intersection of race, ethnicity, and gender, and vice versa, Mara. It's how intersectionality may be transformed in a process of what Eckert called refeudalization, and is, so to say, as a new conjuncture probably in modern capitalism. I don't know who would like to answer first. Mara, you? Yeah?
Bueno, si quieren.
All right, yes, if you will. So I would say that what happens with intersectionality is that it allows us to understand or carry out a more precise diagnosis of what is happening today. And in that diagnosis that is much more precise, we can understand the complexity that is operating today. And in this way, we can perhaps re-signify something that seemed past, and perhaps create new labor ways that are anchored in other temporalities. I even think that when we talk about multiculturalism that is also neoliberal, we perhaps seem to be talking about something that is very new, but at the end of the day, we're also touching upon fragmentation ways of differences that are previous to that. Therefore, I think that effectively intersectionality may serve to show how these refeudalization logics work in the contemporary and current world. However, I would also like to understand that these affect population in very different ways, and for this, intersectionality perhaps would allow to have some nuances and affirmations that may seem too general. That would be my first comment. I hope I was clear. Yes, absolutely. And I think this is exactly an open dialogue. So, Sighart, I would like to now give you the
ability to answer the question, to enter in this dialogue.
Yeah, thank you very much for your comment, and thank you very much for this interesting question. I think you can combine, in a way, the approaches of intersectionality and refeudalization by thinking of how the new wealthy class of super rich is in urgent need all over the world in cheap, very cheap female labor. Yes, and this is producing a new kind of gendered inequality that is, I think, directly the outcome, yes, of the refeudalization of modern capitalism. So it is reinforcing, yes, this polarization of wealth and the new wealthy class. This is reinforcing traditional forms of female dependency, yeah, towards the wealthy class of predominantly male owners, yes, of hyper concentrated capital. Yeah, so I think there is a direct connection, yeah, between gender inequality and refeudalization, and the global care chains I mentioned in my talk is one example for this. And this is affecting, in particular, female care workers all over the world.
Oh, thank you. I would say the floor is open for discussion. So you know the procedure. You can raise your hand or write in the chat. Actually, we have a vivid, lively discussion in some chats in YouTube. But here I saw Sergio with a commentary.
Yeah, sorry to take the opportunity again to talk after having already had my presentation. But after this really two fascinating presentations, I think it's impossible for not making questions. I'd like to ask our first question to Sikhat, and of course, I know this sort of metaphor, refeudalization, and I know part of your work more related to state, but in this presentation, I think this opening for also addressing global capitalism is quite interesting. But my question is, if it comes really to global capitalism, I'm not sure that refeudalization is the better metaphor, since feudalism was actually a European phenomenon. And if you compare with the other sort of scholarship, more represented in the presentation of Mara, in which decolonizing colonialism was actually the past phenomenon, which is actually seen as having been continued in the present. So my question to you, Sikhat, would be, how do you react to this attempt to actually apply the same questions you are addressing, such as extreme inequalities, as also a return as unfree labor, as this sort of undifferentiation of spheres, politics, law, and economy. This is also addressed under a sort of recolonization, which is actually the global form of capitalism and not feudalism. And the second question is, how do you see the continuity? Because you are talking about refeudalization, but the sort of events you are describing in the global south, they have been actually everywhere and always there. So there is not a sort of refeudalization. This is a continuity. So sorry, I talked too much, but very brief to Mara. Mara, lo que quisiera saber es si esa idea que tomas de Angela Davis.
Mara, I would like to know if this very fascinating idea you've taken from Angela Davis about the intersectionality of battles is based on what you have observed occurring in Latin America above all else, and if you perceive that there's a type of intersectionality of fights, or if these fights against inequalities are above others. A lot of the time there is great difference present here. So how can we think about effective intersectional partnerships?
And I have Jochen Kemner also here on my screen.
Yeah, thank you again also for your presentations. And I think also you treat two different ideas and concepts. I think there's again a kind of common ground which we can explore. And this is what Mara has labeled as traveling theories and the impact they might have. And I think you've shown that these theories are traveling beyond time, beyond borders, but also beyond disciplines and beyond the academic sphere. So I have one related question for both of you. Mara, me parece que el concepto de la interseccionalidad funciona todavía.
Mara, I think that the concept of intersectionality still works as an analytical academic instrument. But listening to you, I was thinking about what is happening, above all else, in the US, for example, with critical race theory, which has become a political mobilization term. But it hasn't been so much appropriated by historically affected populations that have suffered racism, but now we have this idea in our heads that there's an innate blame possessed by whites. For example, we see this at schools and universities. So my question is, how you see this phenomenon, looking at the appropriation of a term such as this one.
Not in terms, but perhaps how you see this occurring on the far right. If you look at Latin America, for example, Colombia or Brazil, do you see an incipient form of this debate?
The idea of refeudalization in global capitalism, and this is obviously related to Sergio Costa's question, is what is happening when such a term is used to analyze the processes in a region where it is least doubtful that there was a feudal epoch, or as Sergio mentioned, that there was that you have seen this kind of a break where we have to or where we can come back to. At least when we see feudalism in the sense that we have at least those who have been socialized in Europe and have gone to European schools, as we have learned to know the term in our history classes.
Okay, so I think very big questions, and yeah, probably we Mara would like to answer first, and secondly, Zikat.
Bueno.
Yes. Okay, I will go first. I would have preferred to have a little more time to think of my answer, but that's fine. Okay, I would like to respond to Sergio. I think that it's a real need to move away from entity politics, and we need to stop looking at difference in identity politics and look more at solidarities and partnerships. We saw the murder of George Floyd and global protests. And so here, there are Black people who've been historically affected by these phenomena, but I think now that this is moving more towards young groups and adults who are very diverse and supporting this cause. So what I think is interesting is how in almost all movements we're seeing an adoption of these cross-cutting matters. For example, the fight against extractive practices, the fight and the protest against murders of social leaders, also the fight against climate change. These demands no longer belong to the agenda of one sole movement, but rather, part of what we call social justice. And I think that that's what's interesting, because intersectionality has taken on this kind of approach. So it's not, when it's about gender issues, we see Indigenous women at the heart of the fight against extractive activities in their territories, for example. And we see continued violence. This is something that we thought that this was a private matter, but now we can see how this becomes femicide, and it can also be about how women's bodies become arms of war. We see continuity between the body, land, and territory. So we have seen some cases in Bolivia and Guatemala. We can see a continuum of violences that begin with women's bodies and then talk about what we are doing against the planet or to affect the planet. So we start to see the breaking down of barriers between social movements. But my answer is that I am optimistic as long as we see a promotion of these intersectional thoughts
that have redefined these marginal areas. We're not only talking about the United States, and I think this is becoming a standardized, it's been used for standard depoliticized term, but now it's being repoliticized. And this connects to the question asked by Jochen. There are two ways to approach intersectionality. We can talk about groups and territories, but I also think that intersectionality enables us to understand operations and see how even a politician like Jair Bolsonaro understands that his government's legitimacy is about the patriarchy, white supremacy, and government power. So we can see the implication of power relationships that are sustaining domination, positions of domination. Of course, looking at intersectionality is always seeing an elimination of the emancipatory content. I think that the murder of Marielle Franco is the tragic symbol of this intersectionality, because we saw all of the matters that she was fighting against come together. She is a Black lesbian involved in social movements. So I think that intersectionality can also be used to understand white supremacy. Obviously, this is more of a US debate, and it's about the use of critical race theory in a different context, looking at the use of this critical theory. The same thing could happen here. This is a new use. It's going to depoliticize the original context in which this concept was created, or it will expand it. So I don't think that it's a clear answer. I think the answer is it depends. It depends on the use that we give to this critical race theory. So what's most important, more than adjectivizing this as critical, we have to be critical of race theory. That's what I think. I think that's what's most important here. I think that I've responded to these two questions, but I would like to say something that I didn't say to Professor Neckel. I think that when it comes to refeudalization, it's also about thinking about how we might put coloniality in parallel. I think that it prolongs the colonial workings in the present, and that leads to refeudalization. So how can we look at these things in parallel so we can continue with this conversation? Okay.
It's your opportunity to enter the discussion, Eckert. So go ahead, please.
Okay. It's not so easy. Very complex questions. Let me react to Sergio first. Yes, I don't think that we really disagree. Yes, because my theory of refeudalization is all about that the colonial and the feudal elements of capitalism, were always there, but in different degrees, and that the globalization of capitalism and the neoliberal shift of capitalism was reinforcing this colonial and feudal elements of capitalism in a very massive way. So it's on the one hand a continuity, because there is no clear separation between modern capitalism, and pre-modern times, and I, in a way, go back to Max Weber, who was exactly this opinion, that the class-orientated capitalist society is always accompanied, by feudal elements. There is no clear-cut between this. Yes, and so I don't think that we really disagree about this point. Yes, and what about feudalism and the theory of refeudalization in part of the world where feudalism never existed? Yes, I think it is no precondition of refeudalization that there has been a feudal system in history. Yeah, it is more a question of a feudal principle of domination, and this principle is the unification of economic and political power, so that you cannot anymore separate between economics and politics, between market and the state. Yeah, and it is more a structural than an historical question.
So we actually also have a very lively discussion in the chat, and actually I want to put some questions or bring some questions in here, and we have also the question, the space for another question open. So meanwhile, I read out the two questions. Probably someone would like to raise his or her hand. Milena Orillo pregunta, ¿cómo pensar la interseccionalidad de las
How can we think about the intersectionality of fights without juxtaposing them and taking their singular historical and social weight away from them? I'm thinking of the term Chiksi from the Kusikanki Riviera region. And Edith Otero asks Mara, are there any researchers who have criticized intersectionality for their lack of methodological concreteness? What is your view on this, and how can we work on this empirically? Thank you.
And as I don't see any more hands raised up, I would suggest that we have a final statement of both of you on this discussion on social inequality, refeudalization, intersectionality, and we end this panel with these two statements. So, Mara, it's yours.
Bueno. Muchas gracias, Olaf. Y gracias.
Well, thank you very much, Olaf, and thank you for the questions that came forth. I think that regarding intersectionality, well, the same happens with what has happened with the theory of coloniality. It has great certainties in terms of what it sees as a diagnosis element. However, it needs theories developments to be able to have empirical concretions. And I think that we are undergoing exactly this phase, meaning each work that we do using intersectionality is contributing to the concretion of intersectional thinking, not only as an element that allows us to think reality in better ways, but also that allows us to make an applied use of that knowledge. But it's something that is undergoing, that's being constructed. So I'm very aware of this. However, I do think that there are important advances, and I want to be brief because I know that we're very limited on time. So in other works, I have used the Cheche concept of Silvia Rivera Kusikahi, what you've just mentioned, to be able to talk about ways of understanding the different, how these, well, this Czech concept is very interesting because it allows us to talk about dimensions that may seem in opposing positions without needing to overlap in a synthesis. And I think that is very interesting about Cheche. And I think that intersectionality is not actually loading off singular way to any other struggle, but that would be another topic. And I don't want to go further on, and I don't want to use the floor anymore because I know that we're very limited on time and I want to let other people talk. But thank you very much for the reflections you've shared.
And really have a very last question from Lisa Marie Meyer. Would you agree that the common ground of both of your investigations are women's bodies that historically have been an arena for, first, intersectional discrimination, second, feudal extractivism? So probably Zekat, you would like to start?
Sorry. Yes, of course. You can see it in that way. It's not the only common ground. Yeah. The body of exploited labor force, the bodies of exploited workforce. This is a common ground of the capitalist development in general. Yeah, and the intersectional perspective is relevant and important in this respect, as the gender dimension makes clear that that modern capitalism is in need of female work, which cannot substitute by other persons. Yes, and this so I would agree to this command. Yes, but I would say in general a lesson of this panel could be, and a lesson for me is that a study of capitalism today can only be on a global scale. And if you study global capitalism, all these different developments of colonialism, of feudal history, yes, of exploitation of human bodies come into account. Yes, and I think this is the great challenge of social theory in 21st century in general.
Okay, thank you. Mara, you have the last word.
O sea, realmente quisiera simplemente...
Well, I would simply like to thank you for the possibility of thinking about inequality in more complex ways. I also share the same point that Eckert just made. We need to also talk about a global scale about these topics, but global is not in opposition to local, and it has to be based on contextualized and localized concepts, how we can create those global dialogues. I also think that that is the difference of what, for example, the feminist epistemology and intersectional epistemology contributes or offers. What it wants to approach is the approximation of knowledge that are localized and contextualized, but do understand stories as connected stories. And in this sense, the history of what happens in Latin America today cannot be unlinked from the history of colonization, and that's why the coloniality concept allows us to create those bridges, which have been very helpful. And that's also why it's so important to decolonize intersectionality, to be able to use it in a different manner, to the way in which was born in that US context, to talk about a labor complex conflict in the General Motors case, which was what I wanted to present.
Thank you, Mara. Thank you, Zekat, for this really rich and inspiring conceptual and theoretical and also practical debate. I really enjoyed it, and thank you all the panelistas of this panel for this discussion on social inequalities and political participation. I think we have a lot of elements to think about and to rethink concepts that we use, and probably in other events we can deepen in our discussions and especially also in the transregional perspectives. Finally, I only want to thank Nadine Polvogt and the Colors team for the organizational work of this event, and also especially interpreting Colombia for the great effort and in translating all these complex debates. So thank you for that. Thank you all for participating in this event, and have a nice evening, nice afternoon, wherever you are.